The tranquil afternoon. The day had arrived in a quiet suburban neighborhood nestled on the outskirts of the city, where time seemed to crawl at a gentle pace. The air, cool but not too cold, carried the subtle scent of blooming jasmine and fresh-cut grass. Everything seemed at peace. Houses stood like guardians along the tree-lined streets, their neat yards offering an unspoken sense of pride. The sun hung high in the sky, painting everything beneath it with golden hues. Birds chirped merrily from branches overhead, creating an almost musical symphony of peace. It was the kind of afternoon that made you believe that the world could be kind, calm, and filled with hope. In the midst of this idyllic scene, two officers, Michael and Edward, sat in their patrol car, their eyes scanning the streets for any sign of trouble. There were no sirens wailing, no calls to answer, no high-speed chases or confrontations to break the monotony. Just the sound of the car's engine purring softly as it rolled along the street. Edward sighed, clearly struggling to stave off the creeping boredom that was setting in. "I swear," he muttered, glancing out of the window, "if I don't see some action today, I'm going to fall asleep right here." Michael, who had been more content with the tranquility of the afternoon, chuckled. "Relax, Edward. Not every day can be like the movies. Sometimes we're just the caretakers of peace," he replied, trying to offer a bit of reassurance. But Edward wasn't convinced. His eyes darted around, looking for anything at all, to break the monotony. "Yeah, well, at least the movies have something interesting happen." Michael just smiled and shook his head, letting his partner indulge in the complaint. After all, there was nothing wrong with a slow day when the world was peaceful. The conversation hung in the air between them, soft and unhurried, when Michael's eyes caught sight of an elderly woman walking down the sidewalk ahead. She didn't look out of place, not in a neighborhood like this, but there was something about her that caused Michael to squint and lean forward. She was moving slowly, each step calculated and deliberate. Her body seemed to fight against gravity with every motion, her frail figure bearing the weight of years and life's hardships. One of her legs was stiff, barely lifting as she moved, and she leaned heavily on a cane that looked just as worn and tired as she was. Her slow pace, coupled with the quiet strength emanating from her despite her physical challenges, struck a chord in Michael. For just a moment, the hustle and bustle of their routine patrol seemed to fade into the background. "Hey, Edward, take a look at this," Michael said, his voice low, almost thoughtful. Edward, always quick to find something to amuse himself, turned toward the woman. He looked at her and then back at Michael with a smirk. Well, what do we have here?" he said, his voice tinged with mockery. "Looks like she's carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders." Michael, his gaze still locked on the elderly woman, laughed half-heartedly. "Maybe she's training for a snail marathon," he joked, his voice loud enough to carry through the stillness of the afternoon. Their laughter echoed down the street, disturbing the calm in a way that felt jarring. The woman paused in her tracks, her head slowly turned towards the source of the noise, her tired eyes scanning the patrol car as if trying to make sense of what was happening. A look of confusion flickered across her weathered face, and her lips trembled slightly as if she was on the verge of tears. There was hurt, too, in her eyes, a silent, invisible wound. She had heard them, and their laughter stung. For a moment, the air seemed to thicken around her, a heavy silence hanging between them. Then, summoning all the strength she could muster, she called out to them. Her voice was soft but carried a tremor, as if it had taken every ounce of courage to speak. "Why are you laughing at me?" she asked, her words barely audible but carrying an undeniable pain. "I've done nothing to deserve this mockery." Edward's smirk remained, but Michael's smile faltered slightly. Neither man had expected this reaction, and it caught them off guard. Edward, not one to back down, gave a small shrug. "Oh, lighten up, Grandma," he said dismissively, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "We're just having a little fun." But the woman didn't flinch. Her grip on her cane tightened as she steadied herself, her frail body standing firm despite the world seeming to weigh heavily on her. She took a small, unsteady step forward, her voice now rising, no longer a trembling whisper, but a steady, unwavering plea. "You call this fun?" she asked, her gaze sharp and resolute, mocking an old woman who's just trying to get by. "You're supposed to be protectors of the people, not bullies." The words hit Michael and Edward harder than they had anticipated. Edward shifted uncomfortably, clearly irritated by the woman's refusal to back down. "Lady, you're taking this way too seriously," he said, crossing his arms over his chest as he leaned back in his seat. "We're just joking around. Go on with your day and leave us alone." But the woman stood her ground. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves around them, but she remained unmoved, both in body and spirit. "I may be old," she said, her voice growing stronger with each passing moment, "but I have rights. You cannot treat me like this. I will not be silenced." Her defiance seemed to surprise both officers, and for a fleeting moment, they were caught off guard. The woman's courage was not something they had expected from someone who appeared so frail. They had anticipated submission, resignation, but not this strength, this dignity. Michael recovered first, his smile fading into something harder. His voice was cold now, authority laced with a touch of irritation. "You're causing a scene," he said, his words sharp. "If you don't move along, we'll have no choice but to take action." The woman, though visibly shaken, did not waver. "Action," she repeated, her voice steady. "Go ahead. Do what you must. But I will not let you disrespect me without consequences." Michael and Edward exchanged a brief, uneasy glance before exiting the patrol car. Their boots made a sharp sound on the gravel as they approached the woman. Michael reached out and grabbed her arm roughly, pulling her toward the car with more force than necessary. "Enough," he commanded. "You're coming with us." The woman cried out in protest, her voice rising as she was forced into the back of the patrol car, the indignity of it all settling into her bones like a poison. Her tears flowed freely now, but her head remained high. Despite her frailty, despite her age, her spirit refused to be broken. The car doors slammed shut, and the vehicle pulled away, leaving behind a quiet street that seemed even more still in the wake of the woman's humiliation. The officers were silent as they drove toward the station, but the weight of what they had done was slowly starting to sink in. It wasn't just the old woman they had disrespected. It was something much deeper, something far more significant. As the patrol car pulled into the station, the atmosphere shifted. Officer Michael and Edward could sense it. The unease in the air, the silent tension that filled the station as the officers noticed the elderly woman being led inside. Word traveled fast among the ranks. Something wasn't right. And then the captain emerged. The moment his eyes landed on the woman, everything changed. His face paled, and his eyes widened in recognition. "Mother," he whispered, his voice trembling. The air seemed to freeze around them. The unseen truth. The captain's voice echoed through the room like a bolt of lightning, his shock and disbelief evident. His eyes locked with the elderly woman's, and something deep within him seemed to shift. His commanding presence faltered for just a moment, revealing a vulnerability no one had ever seen before. In that brief second, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, as if even the walls knew that something was about to unfold, something that would not only change the course of that day, but would leave an indelible mark on everyone involved. Michael and Edward stood frozen in place, their once confident expressions now replaced with the same bewilderment that painted the captain's face. They exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier bravado evaporating like mist under the heat of realization. The elderly woman, though her body trembled with the weight of the moment, did not break her gaze. Her eyes were steady now, filled not just with the pain of the past few moments, but with something deeper, a quiet dignity, the kind of dignity that comes only from having lived a life full of trials, struggles, and victories that most could never even imagine. She had been silent throughout the long ride. But now, in the face of this unexpected recognition, she spoke. Her voice was soft, yet unmistakably strong. "Yes, my son," she said, her words gentle but heavy with meaning. "It's me." The captain's face shifted once more. His features, which had been hard and unyielding only moments before, softened as his gaze fell upon his mother. His throat constricted, and for a heartbeat, he was just a son who had not seen his mother in far too long. He quickly stepped forward, his voice filled with both guilt and love. "Mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible. What happened? What did they do to you?" The elderly woman looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and strength, as if she were seeing her son for the first time in years, not as the captain of the police force, but as the little boy she had raised, the boy who had once been her world. "They mocked me," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "They didn't see me as a person, just a frail old woman they could laugh at and dismiss. They humiliated me, treated me like I didn't matter." The room was thick with the weight of her words, and even the other officers present stood in stunned silence, as if they too were beginning to understand the gravity of the situation. The woman's words had cut through the air like a blade, leaving everyone in the room to reckon with their own actions. The captain's eyes filled with unshed tears as he looked down at his mother, unable to hide the guilt that consumed him. His hand shook, his uniform suddenly feeling too tight, too uncomfortable. "Mom, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I had no idea. I swear, if I had known, if I had been there to protect you, this would never have happened. I promise you. I'll make this right." The elderly woman reached out slowly, placing a trembling hand on her son's arm. Her touch was soft, but it held an unmistakable firmness, as if she was grounding him in the moment, reminding him that this was not just about her pain. It was about something much bigger. "I know you didn't know, my dear," she said with a sigh, her voice gentle yet full of wisdom. "But it's not just about me. It's about respect. About treating people with dignity, no matter who they are or how old they get." The captain's face hardened as the weight of his mother's words sank in. The shame of what had occurred began to gnaw at him, and he realized, with a sinking feeling, that it wasn't just his officers who had failed in their duties. It was him too. He had allowed a system to operate without empathy, a system that had placed power in the hands of those who had forgotten what it meant to care for the people they served. He had neglected the humanity of those who needed it most. He turned to face Michael and Edward, the two officers who had humiliated his mother. His expression was no longer that of a captain giving orders, but of a man who had just been forced to confront a harsh truth. "What the hell were you thinking?" he demanded, his voice trembling with a fury that was barely contained. "Do you even understand who this is?" Edward stammered, trying to find words that would justify his actions, but his voice faltered. We didn't know, sir," he muttered, his eyes dropping to the floor. "We didn't mean any harm. It was just a joke." The captain's fury only deepened, his eyes blazing with anger. "A joke?" he thundered. "You think mocking an elderly woman struggling to walk is funny? You think treating her like some sort of punchline is acceptable? This woman is my mother, and you humiliated her in front of everyone." The two officers stood motionless, their faces pale, their mouths silent. They knew that no words could excuse their behavior now. They had crossed a line that, once crossed, could never be undone. "You," the captain continued, pointing at each of them in turn, "will answer for this. You'll answer to your colleagues, to this department, and to the people you swore to protect. And as for you," he turned back to his mother, his voice softening once more, "I am so sorry. I will make sure this never happens again. Not to you, and not to anyone." The elderly woman, still standing with the strength of a woman far younger than her years, nodded slowly. "I know, dear," she said, her voice calming his racing thoughts. "But it's not just about what happened to me. It's about how we treat each other in this world. We cannot allow people to forget their humanity, especially when they are given the power to protect and serve. The captain looked at his mother, and in that moment, everything became clear. The weight of his uniform, the authority that he had once wielded with pride, now felt hollow. It wasn't enough to simply uphold the law. It was about upholding respect, empathy, and compassion. The law could be a tool, but it was the heart of the people that truly made the difference. He turned back to Michael and Edward, his decision made. "You two," he said, his voice hard and final, "are dismissed from duty, effective immediately." The room fell silent as the reality of the captain's decision sank in. Michael and Edward exchanged a long, uncomfortable look before nodding solemnly. They had no argument left, no defense for their actions. They had taken something precious, the trust and dignity of an innocent person, and had trampled on it. And now they had to face the consequences. Without another word, they turned and walked out of the room, their steps heavy with shame. As they left, the captain turned to his mother, his face softening once again. "I won't let this go, Mom," he said, his voice filled with resolve. "I'll make sure we change things, real change. For everyone. For you." The elderly woman smiled gently, the lines of her face softening as she placed a hand on her son's arm. "I believe you," she said quietly. "But remember this, son. Real change begins with respect for every single person, no matter their age, their race, or their status. Never forget that." And in that moment, the captain knew that he would never forget. The lesson was clear. Power and authority meant nothing without compassion and respect. The badge he wore was not just a symbol of law. It was a symbol of service to the people, of protecting and upholding their dignity in every circumstance. Outside, the world continued its slow, quiet march, unaware of the storm that had just passed through the station. But within the walls of that room, something had shifted, and it was a shift that would carry on for years to come. The captain would never again look at his uniform the same way, and he would never again forget the lesson his mother had taught him. The lesson of respect, the lesson of humanity, and the lesson of standing up for what is right, no matter the cost. The ripple effect. The days following that fateful afternoon felt like a slow but inevitable transformation. It wasn't just the captain's life that was changed. It was the lives of everyone in the department, the community, and even those who had no direct connection to the incident. The story of the elderly woman's courage in the face of humiliation began to spread, quietly at first, like a ripple across a pond, touching people in ways that none of them could have predicted. Back at the station, the atmosphere had shifted from one of routine indifference to a palpable tension. Whispers ran through the halls as officers exchanged glances, some filled with regret, others with disbelief. The captain's decision to dismiss Michael and Edward from duty had sent a shockwave through the department, forcing everyone to confront the reality of their actions, their responsibilities, and the power they wielded. But it wasn't just the captain's authority that had shaken the station. It was his mother's words, her insistence on the need for respect, empathy, and humanity that resonated deep within each officer's heart. Even those who had been indifferent or dismissive of the elderly woman's plight could no longer ignore the truth of what had occurred. It was as if a mirror had been held up to their own behavior, and they had been forced to see the reflection of their own flaws. As the weeks passed, the captain worked tirelessly to ensure that such an incident would never happen again. He implemented new training programs for his officers, ones that focused not only on the technical aspects of law enforcement, but also on emotional intelligence, empathy, and the importance of treating every individual with dignity and respect. The department began to shift its culture, slowly but surely, toward one that valued compassion as much as it valued the law. But the change didn't stop at the station. Word of the incident spread beyond the confines of the department, reaching the community in ways the captain had never anticipated. People began to talk about the elderly woman who had stood up for herself, who had refused to be silenced by those in power. Her story became a symbol of resilience, of quiet strength, and of the need for a more humane world. In the days following the arrest, the elderly woman received messages of support from strangers, from people who had heard about the incident and felt compelled to reach out. Some sent flowers, others sent letters, and a few even came to her door to offer a hand of friendship. They were from all walks of life, young and old, rich and poor, people from different cultures and backgrounds. What united them was their shared belief in the importance of dignity and respect, especially for those who had been forgotten or overlooked by society. One day, as the elderly woman sat in her small living room, sipping tea and reflecting on the events that had transpired, there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find a young woman standing on the other side, holding a bouquet of wildflowers. The woman smiled shyly, her eyes filled with warmth and gratitude. "I just wanted to thank you," she said softly. "Your story, it inspired me. I saw what happened, and it made me realize that we all have a responsibility to stand up for what's right. To stand up for people like you, who deserve to be treated with kindness, no matter how old or frail they may seem." The elderly woman's heart swelled with a mixture of surprise and humility. She had not expected such an outpouring of support, and yet here it was, tangible proof that her stand had made a difference. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But you don't have to thank me. It's just about being human. It's about not forgetting the people around us, even if they're different from us. I may be old, but I still have a voice, and I won't be silenced when something is wrong." The young woman nodded, tears in her eyes. "You've taught me more than you know," she said before turning to leave, the bouquet of wildflowers now a symbol of the growing movement that was beginning to take shape. As more people learned about the incident, the elderly woman found herself becoming a symbol not just of resilience, but of a larger movement that was slowly taking root. She began speaking at local community meetings, sharing her story and her beliefs about the importance of respect and compassion. At first, people came out of curiosity, wanting to hear from the woman who had stood up to the police, who had defied the system that too often overlooked the vulnerable. But soon, they came for the message she carried, that no one should ever be treated as less than human, no matter their age, their appearance, or their station in life. Her message resonated with many. In a world that often felt harsh and divided, where power and authority were too often abused, her words became a balm for those who felt powerless. Her voice, once soft and trembling in the face of mockery, was now a beacon of hope for those who had been silenced for too long. But not everyone was ready for the change that was unfolding. There were still those who viewed the elderly woman's actions with disdain. Those who felt threatened by the idea that power could be questioned, that authority could be held accountable. They whispered behind closed doors, accusing her of stirring up trouble, of challenging the very fabric of the system. But her resolve never wavered. She knew that true change was never easy, and that those who had the courage to challenge the status quo would always face resistance. Yet, the momentum continued to grow. Soon, the captain's reforms within the police department began to bear fruit. The officers who had once been apathetic or harsh began to show signs of change. They listened more carefully to the concerns of the community. They became more aware of their own biases and the power dynamics at play in their interactions with the public. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of failure, still moments when the old ways threatened to take hold again. But the shift was undeniable. And as the community began to heal, the elderly woman's voice became one of the loudest advocates for that healing. She attended town hall meetings, where she spoke with compassion and clarity about the need for empathy in all walks of life. She told the stories of those who had been dismissed, of the elderly, the marginalized, and the forgotten, urging everyone to look beyond their own biases and see the humanity in those they served. The captain, too, became a part of this change. He spoke publicly about his own role in the incident, acknowledging his failures and the lessons he had learned from his mother. He worked tirelessly to rebuild the trust that had been shattered, not just with the community, but with his own officers. His leadership style shifted, becoming more focused on collaboration, understanding, and mutual respect. The ripple effect of that one afternoon, of the elderly woman's defiance in the face of cruelty had reached far beyond what anyone could have imagined. It had transformed a police department, a community, and countless lives. As for the elderly woman, she continued to live her life with the same quiet dignity that had first caught Michael's attention all those weeks ago. But now her life had taken on a new meaning, one that extended far beyond her own survival. She had become a symbol of hope, of the power of standing up for what is right, even when the world seems indifferent. And through her example, the world was slowly starting to change. The unbreakable bond. As the weeks and months passed, the ripple effect from that single afternoon continued to reverberate through the community. The transformation wasn't just happening in the local police department or within the elderly woman's neighborhood. It was touching lives far beyond the borders of the small suburban town. What had begun as an incident of cruelty and disrespect had evolved into a powerful movement, one that was slowly unraveling the very fabric of societal indifference, making space for something far more compassionate and connected. The elderly woman, whose name had become synonymous with courage and dignity, became a beloved figure in the town. People from all walks of life approached her to express their gratitude. They thanked her for her strength, for showing them the importance of standing up when they saw injustice, for helping them remember that kindness, respect, and humanity were the very foundations upon which any community should be built. Her small home, once a quiet refuge, had become a gathering place for anyone seeking advice, comfort, or simply a space to share their stories. She listened to each person with the same patience and compassion she had shown her son all those years ago. No matter how busy her days became, she always had time for others, offering them not just her ears, but her heart. There was a particular young man who had come to visit her regularly. His name was Sam, a local high school teacher who had witnessed the events unfold from a distance. Sam had been in the crowd the day the elderly woman had been humiliated by the officers, and his heart had broken when he saw how she was treated. He couldn't help but feel a deep sense of injustice, but like so many others, he hadn't known what to do. He had hoped that someone, anyone, would step in. But when the elderly woman had stood up for herself, when she had refused to be silenced, it had awakened something within him. After the incident, Sam found himself thinking about her every day. He began to reflect on his own actions, his own sense of duty in the world. He realized that he, too, had been complicit in a system that allowed such behavior to go unchecked. But after hearing the elderly woman speak, after witnessing her unwavering determination, Sam knew he couldn't stay silent any longer. He reached out to her, and over time, they forged a bond, one of mentorship, friendship, and shared purpose. Sometimes, it's hard to know when to speak up. Sam confessed one afternoon, sitting with her in her living room as the sun began to set. "I keep thinking about all the times I should have said something, should have done something, but I stayed quiet. It feels like I let things happen." The elderly woman, who had grown accustomed to offering words of wisdom, looked at him with a soft but knowing smile. "We all have those moments, Sam," she said gently, her voice full of understanding. "We can't go back and change the past, but we can decide what to do now. What matters is that you're willing to act when it counts, that you're willing to speak when it's hard. The world will always need people like you, people who choose to be better, who choose to do better." Sam nodded, absorbing her words as if they were a lifeline he had been desperately searching for. He had spent years teaching students about literature, about the power of words to change minds, but it wasn't until he encountered this woman, who had fought against mockery with nothing but her dignity and her voice, that he truly understood the power of standing up in the face of injustice. Their conversations became a regular part of his routine, and they spent many evenings discussing everything from politics to philosophy, but always circling back to the same central truth: the importance of seeing others, truly seeing them, and respecting their humanity. The elderly woman's wisdom was vast, her experiences stretching far beyond what Sam could comprehend, but in her presence, he felt as though he had found a guide to a more just and compassionate world. One evening, As the two of them sat on the porch, sipping tea under the fading light of dusk, the elderly woman shared a story from her own past, one that revealed the deep well of strength that had sustained her throughout her life. "When I was younger," she began, her voice quieter now, as though lost in thought, "I lived through some very difficult times. My family wasn't well off. There were moments when we went without food, when we were forced to make do with nothing more than hope and grit. But through all those hardships, my mother, your great-grandmother, always taught me something that stayed with me to this day." Sam leaned in, intrigued, eager to learn more about the woman who had become such a powerful influence on him. "My mother would tell me," the elderly woman continued, her eyes distant as if recalling the lessons of her youth, "that strength is not found in what you own or what you can control, but in how you carry yourself when things get tough. It's in your ability to stand tall even when the world is pushing you down. And most importantly, it's in your ability to stand up for others when they can't do it for themselves." Sam felt the weight of her words settle over him like a blanket, wrapping him in a sense of quiet determination. He had thought he knew what strength was, but in that moment, he realized that true strength wasn't just about surviving. It was about helping others survive with you, about ensuring no one was left behind. The elderly woman had taught him more than he could ever have imagined, not just with her words, but with her actions. She had lived her life with grace, dignity, and an unwavering commitment to fairness. Her fight was not just against those who sought to disrespect her, but against the forces of apathy and injustice that allowed such behavior to continue unchecked. And through her, Sam learned that each of them had a role to play in changing the world. They didn't need to be superheroes. They just needed to be people who cared. One evening, after a particularly emotional town hall meeting where the elderly woman had spoken out about the importance of empathy within the community, Sam stood with her outside, a quiet smile on his face. "You've done it," he said, his voice filled with pride. "Your words, they've made a difference. People are listening." The elderly woman looked up at the stars, her eyes reflecting the light from above. "It's not just my words, Sam," she replied softly. "It's everyone who chooses to listen. It's all of us together, deciding that we can do better. We can build a world where respect and compassion are not just ideals, but a way of life." As Sam stood there beside her, he realized that her fight was not just hers. It was a fight for all of them, a fight that would continue as long as people like her existed in the world. He had once been a passive observer, unsure of how to make a difference. But now, thanks to her example, he was ready to take action. He was ready to stand tall, not just for himself, but for others. And in that moment, as the stars twinkled overhead, Sam understood that true change began with the courage to stand up, to speak out, and to never, ever forget the humanity of those around us. A legacy of compassion. As the months turned into years, the ripples caused by that one afternoon had evolved into a current of change that flowed through the community, impacting not just the police department, but the very essence of the town itself. The elderly woman, once just a quiet figure in the neighborhood, had become a beacon of compassion, a living example of how one person's courage could alter the course of many lives. Her legacy was not built on grand gestures or sweeping reforms, but on the small, everyday acts of kindness and respect that she embodied. Her friendship with Sam, the high school teacher, deepened over time. Their conversations had moved beyond simple exchanges of ideas. They had become co-conspirators in a quiet revolution, united by a shared vision of a world that treated everyone with dignity, no matter their age, their background, or their circumstances. They began collaborating on projects aimed at fostering understanding and empathy within the community. They spoke at schools, attended town meetings, and helped organize events where people could come together to share their stories and listen to one another. But it wasn't just the formal events that marked the true depth of the change that was taking place. It was in the day-to-day interactions between the people who lived in the town. A simple smile from a stranger on the street, an offer of help from a neighbor, or the quiet conversations in the local coffee shop where people discussed ways to make the world kinder. These small moments added up, creating a web of interconnected lives, each one supporting the other in ways that were sometimes hard to see but always felt. The elderly woman had become more than just a symbol. She had become a mother, a mentor, and a friend to countless people who had been inspired by her strength. Her house, once a solitary refuge, was now a gathering place for anyone who needed a listening ear. Her door was always open, and her words were always chosen with care, always designed to help others see the world through a different lens. One rainy afternoon, as Sam sat with her in her cozy living room, watching the drops race down the windowpane, he reflected on how much had changed since the day he first met her. He had grown as a teacher, as a man, and as a member of the community. He had learned to listen more carefully, to act with more compassion, and to see the invisible threads that connected him to every other person in his life. "You know," Sam said thoughtfully, "when I first started talking to you, I didn't really know what I was looking for. I just knew I had to do something. But I never imagined how much you'd change my life, how much you'd change all of our lives." The elderly woman smiled, her eyes twinkling as she looked at him. "It wasn't me who changed everything, Sam. It was the willingness to change, the willingness to see the world in a different way. All I did was remind people that kindness is not a weakness, and empathy is not a luxury. They're necessities." Sam nodded, absorbing her words. He had come to realize that the true power of what she had done was not just in the way she had challenged the police officers that day, but in the way she had inspired a collective shift in the town. It was a shift toward a culture where people were not just valued for what they could do or how they could contribute, but for who they were, each individual with their own story, their own struggles, and their own potential for greatness. In the years that followed, the elderly woman's influence spread beyond the town. Journalists came to interview her, intrigued by the woman who had stood up against those in power, the woman who had been brave enough to speak the truth even when it was difficult. Her story was shared far and wide, inspiring countless others who felt marginalized, forgotten, or voiceless. She had become a voice for the voiceless, a champion for the oppressed, and a symbol of the quiet revolution that was taking place not just in her town, but in the hearts of people everywhere. One day, a letter arrived for her. It was from a young woman who had grown up in a nearby city and had read about her in the newspaper. The young woman wrote about how she had been struggling with her own self-worth, feeling invisible and overlooked by the world. She had suffered bullying and rejection, and the weight of it all had seemed unbearable. But when she read the elderly woman's story, something had changed inside her. The young woman wrote that for the first time in years, she felt like she mattered, that she had a voice, a place in the world, and the strength to stand up for herself. "I never thought I'd be able to find my voice," the letter ended, "but now I know that I can, and I want to thank you for showing me how. I'll never forget what you've done for me." The elderly woman read the letter in silence, her heart swelling with pride and humility. She had never set out to become a hero or an icon. She had simply wanted to be treated with respect. But in her quest for dignity, she had sparked something much bigger than herself. A movement of people who refused to be silenced, who stood tall in the face of adversity, and who made it their mission to treat others with the same kindness and respect they had always sought for themselves. The letter was framed and placed on the wall of her living room, alongside the many other letters and messages of thanks she had received over the years. It served as a constant reminder of the power of one person's voice to change the world. But despite all the recognition and admiration, the elderly woman remained humble. She never sought the spotlight, never desired accolades for her actions. Instead, she continued to focus on the work that still needed to be done, ensuring that the lessons of empathy, respect, and compassion continued to grow and spread. As her health began to decline in the years that followed, she passed on her knowledge and wisdom to those she trusted. Sam, who had become her closest ally, stepped into the role of continuing her work. He carried her message forward, always speaking of the lessons she had taught him and the countless others who had been touched by her kindness. The community that had once been fractured by indifference was now a place of unity, bound together by shared values of compassion and mutual respect. In the quiet moments, as Sam sat beside her, holding her hand and listening to her soft breathing, he knew that the woman who had changed everything for him had left behind a legacy that would never fade. Her impact had been more than just the reforms within the police department, more than the town's shift toward greater compassion. It was the profound transformation of countless individuals, each carrying the torch of kindness and respect forward in their own lives. And when she finally passed away, it was not with sorrow, but with a deep sense of gratitude. The community she had helped to heal gathered together to honor her memory, not with grand ceremonies or elaborate speeches, but with quiet acts of kindness that reflected the life she had lived, simple, steady, and full of grace. Her story, her legacy, lived on in every kind act, every word of encouragement, and every person who chose to speak out when they saw injustice. The elderly woman had shown the world that even the smallest voice, when used with purpose, could create an unbreakable bond between people, a bond that could withstand anything. And so her legacy endured, not just as a story of triumph, but as a call to action for all of humanity. A reminder that at the end of the day, we are all connected by our shared humanity, and it is through our compassion for one another that we can truly create a world worth living in. The everlasting flame. Years had passed since the elderly woman's passing, yet her influence continued to shape the town in ways that no one had anticipated. Her legacy, once sparked by a moment of courage in the face of humiliation, had turned into a living, breathing testament to the power of kindness and the ripple effect of compassion. The change she had ignited did not just remain a distant memory or a fleeting moment. It had woven itself into the fabric of the town, into its streets, its schools, its workplaces, and most of all, into the hearts of the people who called it home. Sam, who had become the unofficial guardian of her teachings, had taken on the responsibility of ensuring that her message of empathy and respect endured. He often thought of her in quiet moments, her words echoing in his mind like a constant reminder of the path she had set before him. Though she was no longer physically present, her spirit seemed to infuse everything he did. It was in the way he interacted with his students, in the way he listened to his colleagues, and in the way he spoke at community gatherings. Her lessons were passed on, not through grand speeches or elaborate teachings, but through small, deliberate acts of kindness. When a new teacher arrived at the school, unsure and nervous in her new role, Sam made it a point to show her the ropes with patience, offering guidance without judgment. When a neighbor was struggling to care for their elderly mother, Sam was the first to offer assistance, bringing groceries or simply sitting with her so that the neighbor could take a break. These acts, while small in themselves, were part of a larger shift in the town. The people were no longer just living in proximity to one another. They were living with purpose, intent on making the world a kinder place, one act at a time. But it wasn't just Sam who had carried the torch. The town, collectively, had embraced the values the elderly woman had instilled. Her memorial, which had been built in the center of the park where she had often taken her walks, was a place not just for reflection, but for connection. It wasn't a traditional statue or monument, but rather a gathering place. A bench surrounded by flowers and trees, with a plaque that simply read, "In memory of one who showed us all the power of respect and kindness." People sat there, not just to honor her, but to find peace, to reflect on their own roles in the community, and to remember that each of them had the ability to make a difference. Every year, on the anniversary of her passing, the town held a day of service, where residents came together to volunteer in various ways. Planting trees, cleaning parks, cooking meals for the elderly, or organizing clothing drives for the less fortunate. It had become a tradition, one that Sam had helped to establish in the years following her death. It wasn't just about commemorating the woman who had sparked the change. It was about ensuring that her message remained alive and vibrant in every corner of the town. One year, during the day of service, Sam was walking through the park when he noticed a group of teenagers gathered around the bench, laughing and chatting. Normally, the presence of a group of teenagers would have gone unnoticed, but this time, something caught Sam's attention. They weren't just hanging out. They were talking with an elderly man who had been a part of the community for years, but who had always kept to himself. Sam had seen him around, but the man rarely spoke to anyone. Curious, Sam walked closer and overheard part of their conversation. The teens were asking the elderly man about his life, his experiences, and his memories of the town. They weren't just making small talk. They were genuinely interested in hearing his story. The old man, usually so reserved and solitary, was smiling, his face lighting up as he shared tales of days gone by, of how the town had changed over the years, and of how much he had learned from the people around him. Sam felt a pang of gratitude and pride. The young people of the town, who might have once dismissed the elderly man as irrelevant or invisible, were now engaging with him, hearing him, and valuing his life. It was a small moment, but one that represented the broader shift in the town's culture. Respect and connection had become the foundation of their relationships, not just between the older and younger generations, but between all people, no matter their background or station in life. As the years continued to unfold, the elderly woman's teachings remained as vital as ever. Sam, now in his early 40s, had become a respected figure in the community, not just for his role as a teacher, but for his commitment to the values that had been passed down to him. His students, many of whom had grown up hearing the story of the elderly woman, began to internalize the lessons of respect, compassion, and empathy. They carried those lessons with them into their own adult lives, passing them along to their children, their peers, and their coworkers. One evening, as Sam sat in his living room, sorting through some old boxes of personal items, he came across a folder of letters from students. They were letters he had received over the years, some of them written just after graduation, others years later, when the students had gone on to make their mark in the world. As he read through them, Sam was struck by the number of times his former students mentioned the elderly woman, how her story had influenced their decisions and shaped their views on life. Some had written about how they had stood up for others in difficult situations, others about how they had committed themselves to careers that involved helping people, social work, counseling, teaching, and even law enforcement. One letter, in particular, stood out. It was from a former student named Marcus, a young man who had grown up in a difficult neighborhood and who had struggled to find his way. Marcus had once been a student who barely engaged, who kept to himself and never seemed to care about much. But after hearing the story of the elderly woman, something had shifted within him. He began volunteering at a local youth center, working with kids who came from similar backgrounds to his own. Over the years, he had become a mentor to many of them, helping them to see their potential and to believe in the power of kindness. In his letter, Marcus wrote, "I wanted to let you know that the story of that woman you told us about in class, that has stayed with me. I think about it every time I'm working with the kids, every time I see someone being treated unfairly or with disrespect. I've made it my mission to live the way she did, to listen, to care, and to never forget that everyone has a story worth telling. She taught me that one person can make a difference, that the smallest act of kindness can change everything. I hope I'm doing her proud." Sam sat back in his chair, overcome with emotion. Marcus's letter, along with the others, made him realize that the elderly woman's legacy was not just alive. It was thriving, growing with every generation, taking root in the hearts of those who had been touched by her life. She had taught them more than just the value of respect and empathy. She had taught them the power of being present, of standing up for others, and of living with intention. As Sam reflected on this, he made a decision. He would begin writing a book, one that shared not only the story of the elderly woman's courage, but the lessons she had imparted to him and to the community. He wanted her message to be carried far beyond the borders of their town, to reach people who might never have heard of her, but who could benefit from the wisdom she had shared. Her legacy was one that deserved to be spread, for it was a legacy of hope, of connection, and of the unbreakable bond that could be forged when we choose to treat one another with compassion. And so, Sam began writing. Each page was filled with stories of the town's transformation, of the people whose lives had been touched by the elderly woman's simple but profound teachings. It was a book not just about one woman's impact, but about the collective power of a community choosing to live with kindness, integrity, and love. In the end, Sam knew that this was the greatest tribute he could offer, ensuring that the flame of compassion that the elderly woman had ignited would continue to burn brightly, lighting the way for generations to come. The flame lives on. Years later, the town that had once been quiet and divided stood as a testament to the power of compassion and respect. The elderly woman, whose name had become synonymous with strength, dignity, and kindness, had long since passed, but her legacy lived on in every corner of the town. In every act of kindness, every word of encouragement, every hand extended to those in need, she was there, guiding them still. Sam's book, which had chronicled the transformation of their community, had been published and shared with the world. It had reached people far beyond the town's borders, spreading the message of empathy and connection. It inspired others to look inward and ask themselves how they, too, could make a difference in the lives of those around them. The story of the elderly woman became not just a tale of personal courage, but a universal call to action, a reminder that even the smallest act of respect could have an enormous ripple effect. As Sam stood at the bench in the park, now overgrown with flowers and surrounded by the laughter of children, he reflected on all that had been accomplished. He thought of the countless conversations he had had with students, neighbors, and friends, all of whom had been touched by the elderly woman's lessons. He thought of the young people who had grown up in the town and who, because of her influence, had become leaders in their own right, teaching the next generation the values of compassion, dignity, and respect. Sam had grown older too, but there was a sense of fulfillment in him that he had never imagined possible. He had watched the town change, watched it heal, and in doing so, had witnessed the power of collective kindness. It was a slow, steady process, one that took time and patience, but the results were undeniable. The town had become a place where people cared for one another, where differences were celebrated, not feared, and where everyone, no matter their age, their background, or their struggles, was valued for who they were. And yet, as he sat there, he understood that the work was never truly finished. There would always be more to be done, more people to reach, more lives to touch. The elderly woman had taught him that there was no end to the journey of making the world a kinder place. It wasn't a destination. It was a way of living, a continual choice to show up, to listen, to be present for others. He smiled, knowing that her spirit was alive in every corner of the town. It lived in the children who ran through the park, in the elderly man who sat on the bench sharing stories with teenagers, in the teachers who showed up every day with hearts full of compassion, and in the police officers who, years after the incident, now worked to serve and protect with dignity and respect. It lived in everyone who chose, every day, to be the change they wished to see. The lesson that the elderly woman had taught them all was simple, yet profound. Respect is not just a courtesy. It is the foundation of everything we do. Compassion is not a luxury, but a necessity. And it is through these values, through seeing others as human beings worthy of dignity and love, that we build a world worth living in. As the sun dipped low in the sky, casting a warm golden light over the park, Sam stood up from the bench and took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything they had achieved. The story was far from over. It was still unfolding, one small act of kindness at a time. The flame of compassion, once sparked by the courage of one woman, would continue to burn brightly, lighting the way for generations to come. And as Sam walked home, he knew in his heart that the world was just a little bit better, a little bit kinder, because of the choices they had made, and would continue to make together. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.